Hello, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us for this trend talk around future-proofing your organization. We're excited to get started. Without further ado, I'll introduce your trend talkers for today. Actually, I'll let other people introduce themselves, but I'll start. My name is Lindsay Maservi. I'm the Managing Director for our organizational design and strategy work, and I've been working in this space, how to navigate complexity, how to help organizations and teams think about how they can become better at what they're doing, specifically around design and innovation. And this is a topic near and dear to my heart, so excited to explore it with you today.
Hello there, my name is Liz Posse-Corthell. I'm a senior experience strategist, and I'm also a futures thinker, so doing a lot of work and thinking about the future, thinking about unintended consequences, things that are going on today and what they might mean for us in the future are all near and dear to my heart, particularly in this area of disruption. So super excited to be here today and talk to you about some of the things we've been hearing and seeing.
And hi everyone, I'm Jen Brazzelli. I'm the Chief Design Strategy Officer here at MadPow, and as part of that role, I lead what are effectively all of our creative practices here at MadPow, including the couple that you just heard referenced. And this is a topic near and dear to my heart as well, but also especially even when we apply some of what we talk about here today internally at MadPow, there's some lessons and things we've learned. So excited to share and talk a bit about the meta application of these ideas for organizational growth and strength.
So you may have seen some of these headlines over the last several months or last several years that this is, disruption is the new normal, that the 2020s decade will continue to be the most disruptive in history. That's pretty bold. But what this is driving towards is the idea that, again, we need to think about disruption as this new normal. It's not just an interruption to our more stable patterns for work and life. And because of the last several years, it's become clear that we need to rethink and rework how we as individuals, teams, and organizations shift the way that we operate to accommodate these more volatile, uncertain, and ambiguous contexts. So we need to operate with the notion that disruption, is not just the exception, it's the norm. That means moving away from hierarchical decision-making and these slower bureaucratic processes towards becoming more agile, accommodating, and inclusive. So in this trend talk, we're going to explore this notion of disruption and what we've been seeing and experiencing ourselves. We're going to take a few different lenses today. First, we'll talk about what we've been seeing in recent literature and articles that we've been reading that have really struck a chord or resonated with us. We're also going to be talking about what we've experienced in our work here at MadPow as we've helped clients navigate disruption. And then finally, we're going to be having kind of an internal lens shown on what we're doing at MadPow to shift how we operate as an organization towards some of these trends that we've been seeing.
Yeah, and when we're really thinking about disruption, the lens I like to bring from a futures perspective is that futures thinking is really about change. It's really about, as Dr. Anayatollah would say, we use the future to change the present. So it's really about seeing the things that are going on today and what we want to do to build towards that better tomorrow. So it's really core and key to understanding how we operate within times of disruption and how we can move forward to create the futures that we really want to see.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting that a lot of the frameworks and models and ways of thinking that we might hit on today, or that you all might be reading and thinking about, a lot of them aren't new. And I think that's comforting. I think it's heartening to realize that, this is not going to require, well, maybe on some levels it will require a whole shift of thinking for us as a civilization. But truthfully, there are lots of tools, methods, and ways of approaching a very disruptive and unreliable and ambiguous future. And it just so happens that we are kind of arriving at a place where there's an openness and a willingness and an opportunity to put them to good use. Things that may have been relegated in the past to academic institutions or organizations that were on the kind of cutting edge of or bleeding edge of different types of problems. Suddenly now all of these frameworks are actually useful and usable by organizations that may never have had access to them. So a lot of what we'll talk about isn't new, but suddenly is now relevant, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, and as we present, if anything, we're going to have a few prompts along the way for opportunities for folks to reflect. So if you're reflecting, if you're really interested in something we're saying, feel free to add it to the chat. And also we have an area over there, the questions panel, where you can ask questions. So we'll have some time to read those reflections and read those questions to the end. So feel free to put them in there throughout the presentation.
Great, and without further ado, let's dig in. So as we mentioned, across our work and exploration, we've been seeing how the organizations and teams that we work within at MadPow, specifically design and innovation groups, how they've been responding to this continued disruption. And we've seen these as framed as 3 major shifts that we believe will better prepare teams, organizations, and ultimately the world for a new and hopefully better future. The first is this shift from human-centered design to humanity-centered design. So to frame this up a little bit, human-centered design, it's been our standard way of practicing design for years, and it's kind of taken on this way of being seen as the savior approach for how to be more successful, how to be more, human-centered, how to focus on the people at the center. But we've also seen that human-centered design alone can overemphasize the individual user without taking into account those longer-term consequences. So you can see this like with Airbnb driving up prices and driving out homeowners. That was an unintended consequence of having this amazing experience and really focusing on what people need as they're traveling to feel more at home. But it has had those unintended impacts. We've also seen this huge shift in as part of this, raising awareness of these systemic issues that exist in our world, and the role that design and the designer play in perpetuating that. And so this has signaled the shift from, being human-centered design to being more humanity-centered design, where we can focus our beyond just individual needs to really addressing the deep-rooted problems within our society, the wicked problems of racism, equity, sustainability, misinformation, and the list goes on. So more and more we found that clients have been wanting to explore this area, clients and organizations have been wanting to explore this and make progress towards some of these more systemic problems that exist within their organizations and within their teams. So for instance, we found we've done work around improving the employee experience for people of color, and another thing that we've been exploring is how to spread the adoption and integration of more age-inclusive guidelines across the tech industry. So we're being more inclusive, more participatory, and bringing the voices of those that aren't always heard to the mix.
Yeah, and when we try to, approach those problems and our clients come to us with those problems, we realize we kind of have to change our approach. It can't just be this human-centered design practice approach. We really need more of an integrated approach that really brings together human-centered design, which is still valid and still a reasonable way of approaching a design challenge. But we have to bring it along with approaches like, systems thinking. How do we exist within systems, or how do those different systems impact different pieces of the puzzle, or inclusive design, and of course futures thinking, like what does this look like in the future, what are the larger implications, looking a little bit beyond society, beyond individuals and into society at large, a little bit bigger. And futures thinking is one of those major tools that can really help us imagine what those unintended consequences are. In that Airbnb example of something great for the individual, challenging for society, challenging for communities, tracing out some of those unintended consequences and being able to tell those stories through futures.
And Jen, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about how we've been shifting from this kind of focus on me to focus on we within the work that we've been doing at MadPow.
Yeah, I think there's kind of been 2 things that we've been working on ourselves over the last few years, and I don't mind sharing this. As an organization, we benefit from eating our own dog food a little bit and challenging ourselves in the ways that we like to challenge our clients. And one of those is to really try to push the notion of co-design and participatory design where it really needs to go. I think I've seen a lot of progress over the last few years, but really shifting from the expert designer mindset to the facilitator mindset, which we'll talk more about in a minute. But the other is that as within our creative practices, we've really embraced a community of practice model, so that instead of thinking of ourselves as siloed departments or teams, each of which might have their own territory, have their own expert skills and tools, and all that's still true, really pushing to get away from thinking of ourselves as belonging to these tribes or teams or departments, and instead asking, what does it mean to be a member, a contributing member of a community of practice, and for many folks, more than one. So really, we're a unified team made up of many practices, and in that way, we're able to push beyond being cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary to being transdisciplinary. And that kind of work allows us to widen the aperture in the way that systems thinking helps us look at not just localized effects, but longer stretches over both distance and time to see what impacts might come from the work that we're doing. And it makes us more flexible and agile so we can adjust and respond to the future, because we certainly can't predict it all that well. We definitely can't control it, but what we can do is be ready and agile and able to adapt by being flexible communities instead of rigid teams. So that's what we've been working on.
Thanks. So as we go from shifting from human-centered design to humanity-centered design, Jen teed this up a little bit. We also have been exploring the shift from design as expert to designer as facilitator.
Yeah, so this image on the right comes from Liz Sanders, who's really kind of a pioneer in the realm of co-design. Talks about how, the past, the present, the future of what design looks like, and how in the past, in the 80s, we were kind of designing for people, this kind of designer as expert role of, this is what you need, this is what people need, to now I think we're still in this era of kind of designing with people, really valuing participatory design, seeing what that looks like, seeing what it looks like when we invite people in the room. But in the future, we might even kind of see design by people. So instead of designers even as facilitators, maybe designers as enablers, creating the tools that people can design and shape challenges with themselves. So it's really kind of about, moving beyond expecting to be the smartest person in the room to really being the person that brings people together to let design and let change happen. I was talking about this the other day, and I was thinking it's kind of moving from being the architect to the designer of the building, the kind of designer of this grand thing, to being like a little bit more like a city planner, creating the circumstances for which design can occur. So I think it's a useful way of reframing and thinking about how designers might fit into broader context into the future as well.
Yeah, and as part of that, we've been thinking about what is the, what are the most important skill sets within design, within a designer, to move from that, even from expert to facilitator, really to enabler. And yeah, Liz and Jen, any thoughts on what you want to share there?
Yeah, well, I think if you ask yourself, what is the evolution of skills, and maybe not even just skills, but orientation or philosophical mindset from designer to architect to city planner, what does that take? And I think personally, and as well as, from the teams that we lead and the way that we work with clients at MadPow, that there's a lot of focus now on what it takes to be a lifelong learner, what it takes to be someone that can be adaptive and agile. It becomes a very meta set of skills, because the tools, and I mean literally tools as in software, methods we might apply, that's going to continue to change. I think most folks know that those things are going to shift, and what's most important is that you build up the skills and the orientation around being flexible and wanting to continue to learn and grow. And with that, we keep talking about facilitation and maybe even mediation become more important in that role or in that organizational approach to this work. But I would say that it's more than just, do you have good mediator skills? Are you a good conflict negotiator? But rather, are you asking the right questions? There's a quote by Einstein that I think gets attributed to him, but I don't even trust that he said it. But it was like, if I had an hour to spend solving something, I'd spend the first 55 minutes focused on the problem and only the last 5 on the solution. But whoever said it, wherever the credit goes, I think that's really key, both for the designers and the practitioners who are going to continue solving problems, but also for organizations that are in a place to make change and might be partnering with those who do the design work to be looking for that kind of mindset.
Great, thank you. And as part of, the way that I've been thinking about the most important skill sets coming into the 21st, 22nd, 23rd century, is moving from the shift to operating in a way that focuses on predictability and control to really trying to harness this idea of designing for emergence. And this came up, one of the biggest realizations for me really at the beginning of the pandemic was how ill-equipped our organizational processes and structures are at being able to shift away from our typical way of operating, where everything is, again, built on predictability and control and planning, to one where we're able to design more emergently, meaning we can manage uncertainty so that we can better adapt to unexpected challenges and things that emerge, like pandemics or shifts in the job market, and be able to harness emerging opportunities to really push our work and be more successful. So I like to use the metaphor of music, in terms of thinking about what this looks like. So you could think about organizations, really they're meant to operate like an orchestra with a conductor, where everyone has a defined roadmap, which means the sheet music, that dictates when each instrument comes into play or what team comes in. So it's really clearly orchestrated. And there's a clear hierarchy of leadership that the conductor is the one that holds the power and holds the control over the rhythm, the tone, and the overall experience. So their goal is really about perfect execution, that if they follow the plan accordingly and everyone, executes what they're supposed to do, everything comes together perfectly. And it results in a beautiful experience. But with this new disruptive context, we can't always operate that way. We need to operate more like a jazz band or a jazz trio, what you see here. Jazz is untidy, it's untidy, unpredictable, and imperfect. It's messy. And here, the players really have to let go of control and ego to embrace the spirit of spontaneity. They start with the premise of what will happen, like an overall vision of how the set will go, or which songs they're going to play when. And they really rely on that shared set of principles, like the key that they'll be playing in, to keep them aligned, so that the band members really are co-creating the experience as they play and improvise and build on each other's notes. So each team member is really operating as that equal, allowing one another to take turns to create this emergent experience, again, built from a shared vision, agreed upon principles, and ensuring that it really is co-created, that they're able to take those risks together. And so as we think about this metaphor, Jen, as we've been thinking about embracing emergence while we're exploring these new ways of working or operating at MadPow, do you have takeaways or things that you've noticed that you'd like to share?
Yeah, and I can't stress enough how much I love this metaphor. I feel like if anybody were to just take one thing away from this talk, take Lindsay's metaphor about music, because it's so perfect. But it's definitely something that we've been exploring both in some of the work we're doing with clients as well as even internally. And as I mentioned, shifting our mindset towards envisioning ourselves as communities of practice has also meant with that getting away from, as Lindsay mentioned, a hierarchical organizational approach to decision making and leadership. Really looking at embracing more distributed leadership and decision making. That's key because it both makes us more flexible and it does allow for emergence, as Lindsay has mentioned. Again, it's less about roadmaps now and it's more about a compass and a bearing and just heading in that direction, but understanding we might have to make small diversions to our path. As long as we have the means to pause and reflect and say, okay, that took us a little bit off chart now, but we can get back to heading north now that we're back on this path. And that's fine to talk about it in platitudes and philosophies, but what it looks like on the ground is messy. But I think sometimes there's a fear that to move in a direction towards more of a sense and respond kind of community oriented type of work means we're going completely consensus driven, and everything's going to get decided by huge groups of people who never are going to bring clarity. And that's not true. There's a really beautiful balance you can find in the middle. But it's hard. It's hard work. It requires a lot of trust and psychological safety. And the thing that is important is you still need clarity. Just because you might move away from an old-fashioned command and control hierarchical kind of work doesn't mean that we don't still need clarity. In that metaphor, that jazz ensemble, they're not just making stuff up, right? They have good foundational skills. They know how to play their instruments really well. They probably had to do so many scales that they could do them in their sleep, and now they can break the rules. And similarly, they have to know each other. They have to have built a rapport and a trust. They read each other's body language. They know where they're going. So being able to improvise and respond doesn't mean we throw all the rules away and there's no leader and we're just running in all our different directions, but that we actually have to start with a foundation of clarity, skill, trust, and then trust each other and ourselves to actually deviate from those rules and, you know, see what occurs when we let that happen. So I think internally it just becomes a matter of asking, how do we set our people up to do that kind of work? And as I mentioned, it's both skills in, you know, in kind of structure to the extent we know what to expect from each other, even if we want to break the rules. It's also trust and psychological safety. And so building that is really important.
Yeah, and it's important to note, you know, we've tried to embrace this approach on some of the more recent projects that we've done where, you know, the work is a little bit more unwieldy and things where our plans were impacted by disruptions. For instance, you know, we were trying to support some big, large scale transformation efforts within an organization that was undergoing massive attrition of staff and going through reorganizations every couple months. So, you know, when that happened, we had to be more agile and, you know, work with it emergently. So what we did is we started adopting a couple practices that helped us navigate this complexity. And some of you may already be doing this, which is great. The first thing we did was shifting to kind of this more agile team model that allowed us to better sense and respond to what was emerging. That just meant tighter collaboration, which, you know, meant meeting more regularly to share what we're learning, what we're noticing as we're going off and working with different people across the organization. And prioritizing alignment of our work efforts before we went off to execute them. So really spending a lot of time on understanding, you know, what are you doing here? How is that going to connect to what we're doing here? And how do we stay in lockstep to make sure that we, you know, we're working kind of as a cohesive team and working off of each other. The other thing we did was, again, you know, similar to what Jen was saying, we focused on principles over tactics. So getting really clear on what are the principles for how we want to, for what we want to do or how we want to execute our work and the overarching outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And then really letting the smaller work teams that we were working with dictate, how are you going to do this? Okay, if this is the vision, what are the tactics, what are the activities that you think are going to be most successful in getting us there? And really, again, kind of empowering them, letting them be the ones who are co-creating the experience because they know the organization and they know the people that they're working with much better than as they're working on the ground. Then the last thing is just kind of as Jen mentioned, the psychological safety, but recognizing that the taxing toll that this work, you know, just as it stands alone, going through kind of transformation and change and trying to adopt new ways of working, that takes a huge toll on people, on their mental capacity, their energy, and just their kind of physical ability to continually do this. And then adding on to that with disruption, it's a lot. And so we wanted to, you know, recognize that as we were trying to make progress towards these different goals and outcomes, we also had to stop and say, okay, you know, as people were coming and going and as the resources that we had access to became more constrained because people were overwhelmed and overburdened, we had to say, okay, what can we achieve given with what we're dealing with, and how can we set the right level of expectations both with ourselves and the teams that we're working with and our client about the level of transformation that we could reasonably achieve. So again, it's important to note that, you know, this work is hard, this work is tough, but trying to stay, you know, operating like that jazz trio or the jazz band can kind of help you power through and help give the right contexts.
Awesome. So to summarize, some of the things we've heard or talked about today are shifting from, human-centered design to humanity-centered design, shifting from designer as an expert to designer as facilitator, and then shifting from that predictability and control to designing for emergence. So we'd love to hear from you too, like what are some of the trends or shifts you've noticed? If you have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat. I see a few that have come in too. So I can read those out for everyone to answer and think about. We actually have a great question here from Estefania. She's talking about we should be developing those skills, reframing design education to help students develop facilitation skills. I'm curious, Lindsay and Jen, are there any thoughts how to reframe design education, thinking about facilitation skills at the center, or even if someone's no longer in education, like professional development, how to gain those skills too?
I have many thoughts, and I will try to pare them down into 2 sentences. These guys know how I feel about education, as I was a teacher in a past life, and I do still teach. But I think it comes down to a couple things. One, and this is for everybody, even folks who have nothing to do with design education or aren't in that world or are so far along in their career they haven't thought about education in a while, although I'd like to think continuous education is key for all of this. Basically, I think what it boils down to is understanding that as designers, design is one of those unique fields where design itself does not have its own subject matter that is tied to, right? So if you're a designer, you become a subject matter expert in many different things depending on how you are applying the craft of design. And as such, any type of education, whether in the initial stages of someone's entry into this career or throughout your entire career and your craft and your practice over the course of your life, orienting yourself not to specific types of subject matter expertise, but to how you can more easily gain and flex and build that expertise. And that's why I often, find myself kind of sometimes the only voice in the room, advocating for liberal arts types of programs. And when my folks that I mentor and people that I work with ask me for recommendations, books, resources, sure, there are some design specific ones, but more often than not, I tell people to read as much as they can about as many things as they can that have nothing to do with what they're working on. And I continue to feel that that is one of the most important things we can provide to the folks that we might be teaching or mentoring or encouraging our colleagues to do and doing ourselves so that we can do better work for the people we're serving in our craft. So that is kind of my main message. The other minor thing I'll mention, and this has come up in a few conversations recently, if we continue to see the evolution that we've alluded to here over time, that shift from expert to facilitator, architect to city planner, we're going to find that as designers, the things we're doing are things that other people have done with different titles. We are going to look less and less like the old-fashioned design as definition in a role, and that's okay. So I think part of education means embracing that the boundaries of what is design are probably going to become increasingly porous. And I know that that rubs some folks the wrong way, but I believe firmly that that's the direction if we really want to use design for good.
Awesome. Well, that brings us to about time, but I know you have a slide with our contact information on there, Lindsay, because I know that these are all topics we really love to talk about. As you can tell, we love to think about these things. So follow up with us if there are any other questions, and if we didn't have time to answer yours today too.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.